How did two small islands, mere specks in the vast blue of the Caribbean Sea, become a flashpoint for centuries of colonial rivalry? This is the story of Saint Kitts and Nevis. It is a story of ambition, conflict, and immense human suffering. European powers, driven by a hunger for wealth and territory, saw these islands not as homes to indigenous people, but as prizes to be won. Their volcanic soils were perfect for growing a crop that would change the world: sugar. The quest to control this lucrative trade turned Saint Kitts and Nevis into a fiercely contested battleground. For over 150 years, the flags of Britain and France were raised and lowered here, each victory and defeat paid for in blood and treasure, fundamentally shaping the course of empires. The story begins long before the first European sails appeared on the horizon, but it is the arrival of these outsiders that ignited a firestorm of change. Saint Kitts, in particular, earned a reputation. It became known as the mother colony of the West Indies. This was the starting point, the laboratory where the English and French would test their models of colonization. They learned how to cultivate sugar cane on a massive scale. They developed brutal systems to exploit enslaved African labor. The lessons learned here were then exported across the Caribbean, creating a network of immensely profitable yet deeply inhumane island economies that fueled the industrial revolutions back in Europe. These islands were not just passive stages for imperial drama, they were active crucibles. Here, cultures clashed and merged. Indigenous Kalinago, European settlers and enslaved Africans were forced into a new, violent and complex society. The very landscape was transformed. Forests were cleared to make way for endless fields of sugar cane. Grand plantation houses were built alongside the cramped, squalid quarters of the enslaved. Massive stone fortresses, like the imposing Brimstone Hill, were constructed to defend the stolen wealth. The history of Saint Kitts and Nevis is therefore written into the very soil, a testament to its outsized role in the making of the modern world. To understand the sheer scale of this transformation, we must first look back. We must peel away the layers of colonial history to see the islands as they once were. Before the sugar, before the forts, before the flags of empire, Saint Kitts and Nevis were known by other names. They were Liamuiga, the fertile land, and Uwali, the land of beautiful waters. These were the names given to them by the people who had called them home for generations. Their world was about to be shattered, their lands remade, and their history pushed into the shadows. But it is with them, the Kalinago people, that the true story of these islands begins. Long before Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Americas, the islands of the Caribbean were inhabited by vibrant and complex societies. Saint Kitts and Nevis were home to the Kalinago people, also known as the Island Caribs. They were skilled navigators and canoe builders, traveling between the islands in large dugout canoes. Their society was organized around villages, often led by a chief whose authority was based on his prowess in warfare and his leadership skills. They were deeply connected to their environment, understanding the rhythms of the sea, the seasons for planting, and the medicinal properties of local plants. This was a world governed not by clocks and calendars, but by the sun, the moon, and the tides. The Kalinago were expert farmers and fishermen. On the fertile volcanic slopes of Liamuiga, they cultivated crops like cassava, sweet potatoes, maize, and cotton. They supplemented their diet by hunting small animals and fishing in the rich coastal waters. Their homes were typically constructed from wood and thatch, designed to withstand the tropical climate. Community life was central, with storytelling, music, and religious rituals forming the backbone of their culture. They held a profound spiritual belief system, seeing the natural world as imbued with powerful spirits. The volcanoes that formed their islands were not just geological features. They were sacred sites, central to their cosmology and identity. Early European accounts often portrayed the Kalinago as warlike and aggressive, a convenient justification for the violence that was to come. While they were indeed formidable warriors who defended their territories fiercely, this one-dimensional caricature ignores the richness of their society. They had sophisticated traditions of art, creating intricate pottery and weaving cotton into hammocks and cloths. Their social structures were complex, with distinct roles for men and women, and strong kinship ties that bound communities together. Their world was one of balance, a deep and ancient relationship between people and the land they inhabited, a relationship that was about to be irrevocably broken. The arrival of the Spanish in the late 15th century marked the beginning of the end for this way of life. Though Spain did not establish permanent settlements on Saint Kitts or Nevis, their presence in the wider Caribbean brought devastation. European diseases such as smallpox and measles, to which the indigenous people had no immunity, swept through the islands like wildfire, decimating populations. Spanish slave raids also targeted the Kalinago, capturing people to work in the mines and on the plantations of larger Spanish colonies. This period of initial contact was a prelude to the colonization that would follow, a time of disruption and fear that weakened the Kalinago and left them vulnerable to the next wave of intruders. The year 1623 marks a pivotal moment in Caribbean history. It was then that an English captain named Thomas Warner landed on Saint Kitts and established the first successful English colony in the entire region. He had visited the island before and recognized its potential. The soil was rich, there was fresh water, and the native Kalinago population had already been weakened by Spanish incursions and disease. Warner and his small group of settlers began to cultivate tobacco, a crop in high demand in Europe. They were not just farmers, they were the vanguard of an empire. Saint Kitts became the blueprint, the mother colony, from which English influence would spread across the West Indies, forever changing the destiny of the region. Warner's settlement did not go unnoticed. Just 2 years later, in 1625, a French ship, damaged in a battle with a Spanish galleon, sought refuge on Saint Kitts. Its captain, Pierre Belin Desnambuc, saw the same potential that Warner had. Instead of fighting, the two European groups made a pragmatic, if uneasy, alliance. They decided to join forces to eliminate their common obstacle, the remaining Kalinago people. In a brutal act of premeditated violence in 1626, they massacred a large number of the island's indigenous inhabitants, at a site now known as Bloody Point, driving the survivors off the island. This horrific event cleared the way for their colonial project to expand without resistance. With the Kalinago tragically removed from the equation, the English and French formalized their strange partnership. They partitioned Saint Kitts between them. The English took control of the central part of the island, while the French claimed the northern and southern ends at Cape Ster and Basseterre. A formal treaty was signed in 1627, creating a unique and inherently unstable situation of joint sovereignty. For decades, the two rival nations coexisted on this tiny island, their settlers working their tobacco fields and trading, all while casting suspicious glances at their neighbors. This fragile peace was always temporary, a pause in the larger European conflict that would inevitably spill over onto these shores. This peculiar arrangement was driven purely by economics. Both the English and French were there to extract as much wealth as possible. The initial focus was on tobacco, but its price soon fell as production in places like Virginia soared. The colonists needed a new, more profitable crop. The answer came from Dutch traders who had been expelled from Brazil. They brought with them sugarcane and, crucially, the knowledge of how to cultivate it and process it on a massive scale. This sugar revolution would transform Saint Kitts and Nevis from small tobacco settlements into some of the most valuable real estate on the planet, setting the stage for a new and even more brutal chapter of its history. The introduction of sugar cultivation transformed Saint Kitts and Nevis into engines of immense wealth. But this wealth was built on a foundation of unimaginable human cruelty. Sugar production was a highly industrialized and labor-intensive process. It required a vast workforce to plant, harvest, and process the cane under the relentless Caribbean sun. The early system of using indentured servants from Europe, poor individuals who agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage, proved insufficient for the scale of the sugar plantations. The colonists turned to a different source of labor, one that would define the island's society for the next 2 centuries, the transatlantic slave trade. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children were forcibly transported from West Africa to the Caribbean in the cramped, disease-ridden holds of slave ships. This journey, the Middle Passage, was a nightmare of suffering and death. Those who survived arrived in places like Saint Kitts and Nevis to be sold at auction like livestock. They were then put to work on the sugar estates in conditions of extreme brutality. The life of an enslaved person was one of ceaseless, back-breaking toil, from sunrise to sunset. They cut the tough cane with machetes, fed it into heavy grinding mills, and boiled the juice in scorching hot cauldrons, all under the constant threat of the overseer's whip. The profits generated by their forced labor were astronomical. Sugar, often called white gold, became the most valuable commodity in the Atlantic world. It sweetened the tea of ordinary people in Britain and France and generated fabulous fortunes for a small elite of plantation owners, merchants, and financiers back in Europe. Grand plantation houses known as great houses were built on high ground overlooking the cane fields, symbols of the planters' wealth and power. These elegant homes stood in stark contrast to the squalid slave villages, where the enslaved lived in simple huts with minimal provisions, their families constantly at risk of being torn apart by being sold to different plantations. Despite the dehumanizing conditions, enslaved Africans resisted their bondage in countless ways. They maintained cultural traditions from their homelands through music, dance, and storytelling. They practiced acts of sabotage, such as breaking tools or deliberately working slowly. Some managed to escape into the island's mountainous interior, forming small communities of Maroons, and on occasion desperation boiled over into open rebellion. These uprisings were always met with overwhelming force and savage retribution, but they demonstrated the enduring human spirit and the unquenchable desire for freedom. The society built on sugar and chains was a society of deep contradictions, of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, of absolute power and defiant resistance. The shared colonization of Saint Kitts was never destined to last. The island was just too valuable, and the rivalry between Britain and France was, honestly, too intense. Throughout the late 17th and 18th centuries, every time war broke out between the two powers in Europe, Saint Kitts became an immediate battlefield. The island changed hands completely on several occasions. The French would capture the English sections, or the English would overrun the French territories. Each conflict brought destruction, disrupting the sugar production that both sides coveted. This constant state of warfare made it clear that a purely economic presence was not enough. Military dominance was essential for control. To protect their lucrative sugar colony, the British began constructing a formidable network of fortifications. The crown jewel of this defensive system was the Brimstone Hill Fortress. This was an astonishing feat of engineering and a brutal testament to the labor of enslaved Africans. Built over a period of almost 100 years, the fortress was constructed on the steep slopes of a volcanic cone rising nearly 800 feet above the sea. Enslaved masons and laborers hauled massive, hand-cut volcanic stones up the treacherous slopes to build the thick walls, bastions, and barracks. Known as the Gibraltar of the West Indies, it was designed to be an impregnable stronghold, a symbol of British military might in the Caribbean. The fortress faced its greatest test in 1782 during the American War of Independence, when France sided with the Americans against Britain. A powerful French fleet, under the command of Admiral de Grasse, laid siege to Brimstone Hill. For a month, 8,000 French soldiers bombarded the fortress, which was defended by just 1,000 British troops and local militia. The British garrison, cut off and outnumbered, eventually surrendered. It was a stunning victory for the French and a major humiliation for the British. The capture of Brimstone Hill demonstrated the strategic importance of the island and the lengths to which the European powers would go to possess it. However, French control was short-lived. The following year, the Treaty of Paris returned Saint Kitts to British rule, and it would remain under their control from then on. Brimstone Hill was further strengthened, its cannons once again pointing out to sea, ready to defend the island's sugar wealth. Today, the fortress stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its silent cannons and weathered stone walls offering panoramic views of the Caribbean. It serves as a powerful reminder of the island's turbulent past, a monument to the imperial ambitions that shaped its history and to the immense, unacknowledged labor of the enslaved people who were forced to build it. The moral and political tide in Britain eventually began to turn against the institution of slavery. The abolitionist movement, powered by the testimony of formerly enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano and the tireless campaigning of activists, gained momentum. In 1834, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, bringing an end to centuries of chattel slavery throughout the British Empire. For the tens of thousands of enslaved people on Saint Kitts and Nevis, this was a moment of profound, world-altering change. However, true freedom did not arrive overnight. The act included a system of apprenticeship, which forced the newly freed people to continue working for their former masters for another 4 years, a period of transition designed to benefit the planters. Full emancipation finally came in 1838, but it did not bring economic equality. The plantation owners received substantial financial compensation from the British government for the loss of their human property, The freed Africans received nothing. They were left landless and with few options other than to continue working on the same sugar estates for meager wages. The old power structures remained largely intact, with a small white plantocracy continuing to dominate the island's economy and politics. The century that followed emancipation was a period of struggle for the Afro-Caribbean majority as they fought for land, fair wages, better living conditions, and a political voice. The decline of the sugar industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought further hardship. Competition from other sugar-producing countries and the rise of beet sugar in Europe caused prices to plummet. The sugar estates, once the source of incredible wealth, fell into decline. This economic crisis, combined with the social injustices of the colonial system, fueled the rise of a new labor movement in the 1930s. Leaders like Robert Bradshaw emerged, organizing strikes and protests to demand better rights for workers. These movements were the seeds of modern politics in Saint Kitts and Nevis, shifting the focus from labor rights to a broader call for self-governance and an end to colonial rule. The journey toward independence was a gradual one. In 1967, Saint Kitts, Nevis, and the neighboring island of Anguilla became an associated state of the United Kingdom. This granted them full internal self-government, while Britain remained responsible for defense and foreign affairs. However, this arrangement was fraught with tension. Anguilla quickly rebelled and seceded, seeking to remain a direct British colony. On Nevis, there was a growing sentiment for greater autonomy from the central government on the larger island of Saint Kitts. These internal dynamics added another layer of complexity to the final steps toward creating a new, independent nation. A nation that would have to navigate its own path after centuries of being an imperial possession. On September 19, 1983, the flag of the United Kingdom was lowered for the last time, and the new flag of the Federation of St. Christopher and Nevis was raised. After more than 350 years of colonial rule, the two islands became the smallest independent nation in the Western Hemisphere. The new constitution established a unique federal system designed to address the long-standing desire for autonomy on Nevis. The island of Nevis was granted its own legislature, the Nevis Island Assembly, and a premier, with significant control over its own affairs. This structure was a delicate compromise, an attempt to build a unified nation while respecting the distinct identity and political aspirations of each island. In the decades since independence, the nation has faced the challenge of building a sustainable economy. The sugar industry, which had dominated the islands for centuries, finally closed in 2005. It was no longer economically viable and was a painful reminder of the colonial past. The government pivoted towards a new economic model, focusing heavily on tourism and financial services. Beautiful beaches, luxury resorts, and the rich historical heritage of the islands began to attract visitors from around the world. Tourism became the new economic engine, transforming the landscape once again, this time with hotels and marinas instead of sugar mills and cane fields. A key pillar of the modern economy is the country's citizenship by investment program. Established in 1984, it is the oldest and one of the most well-known programs of its kind in the world. It allows foreign investors to obtain citizenship in exchange for a significant financial contribution to the country's development, either through a real estate purchase or a donation to a national development fund. This program has become a vital source of government revenue, funding public infrastructure projects, education and healthcare. It represents an innovative, if sometimes controversial, strategy for a small island nation to secure its economic future on the global stage. Today, the people of Saint Kitts and Nevis navigate a path between preserving their rich, complex heritage and embracing the opportunities of modernity. The legacy of the Kalinago, the struggles of the enslaved, and the battles of empires are all part of the national identity. Festivals like Carnival celebrate the vibrant culture that emerged from this history. The challenge is to ensure that economic development driven by tourism and investment benefits all citizens and does not erase the very history and natural beauty that make the islands unique. The story of Saint Kitts and Nevis is a powerful testament to resilience, a journey from being the crucible of empire to a proud, independent nation charting its own course in the 21st century.